help us think our way out of it. Let me set the stage, if I may, by reminding you how we came to be where we are. I should preface this by saying I'm not an expert on Korean culture or politics. My education in Korean affairs has come in a seat-of-the-pants fashion, beginning in 1994 when I was in the Department of Defense and the first of the recent Korean crises occurred. It was 1994 when North Korea began to unload from a reactor at a place called Yongbyon the fuel rods from a research reactor there, which fuel rods contained enough plutonium for 5 or 6 nuclear weapons. That on top of something they did in 1989, which we still don't completely understand, but which may have given them in 1989, all the way back then, 1, maybe 2 bombs worth of plutonium, but we're not really sure. But for sure, in 1994, they were on the verge of serial production of nuclear weapons. My immediate job at that time was to plan an airstrike on Yongbyon, which I did for John Tillelly, who was in the Army staff at that time. An airstrike which we were very confident we could conduct in such a manner as to destroy Yongbyon, to destroy the reactor, the reprocessing facility, the fuel fabrication facility, the reactors that were under construction, and to essentially entomb that plutonium. And that we could do that without causing the reactor to undergo any kind of Chernobyl-type meltdown and present a radiological hazard to those downwind. So we planned that strike, and we were entirely confident that we could carry out that strike and it would be successful. However, it's a big however, the likely, or at least entirely possible result of carrying out an attack like that on North Korea would be the unleashing of North Korea's large, antiquated but large army across the DMZ onto the territory of our allies in South Korea, triggering the carrying out of a war plan that the United States and South Korea have long maintained together, and which John Tillelly, whom I'll introduce in a moment, was the most recent U.S. architect of. A war plan which would also be successful in the sense that within just a few weeks, probably, the combined forces of the United States and South Korea would destroy North Korea's armed forces and then destroy the North Korean regime. However, in the course of that campaign, many thousands of people would be killed. This is not Desert Storm out in the desert somewhere. This is combat in the crowded, congested suburbs of a modern city, Seoul. Combat of an intensity not seen since anywhere in the world since the last Korean War. Combat that would shock the world when it was brought to your TV screens. That was the situation in '94. That situation was averted, at least temporarily, by the negotiation of an agreement between the United States and North Korea, according to which had many provisions, and I'm sure our speakers will tease some of them out. But one provision, the earliest act that the parties were to take, was that North Korea was to stop what it was doing at Yongbyon and to allow international inspectors in there to look at that plutonium and make sure nothing was being done with it, to look at the reactor and make sure no plutonium was being produced. And for 8 years, until late last year, that agreement was in place. Yongbyon was frozen. Scroll forward a few years. Everything seemed fine at Yongbyon. Along comes 1998. North Korea launches a ballistic missile from North Korea over Japan, another U.S. ally, into the Pacific Ocean. At that time, President Clinton decided, I think rightly, that he didn't know what the United States was doing on the Korean Peninsula. We had lost the bubble since 1994. And he asked for a review of U.S. strategy towards North Korea, and he got a wonderful person, my former boss and now my collaborator, Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who had left the Pentagon at that time, to be the director of that North Korea policy review, and I was his trustee number 2. So I got back into it in 1998, and we asked ourselves, what are we doing with North Korea in the large? And we looked at the option, for example, of trying to get rid of the North Korean regime change. Can we do that? Reforming North Korea, can we reform them? Making some sort of deal with North Korea. And we thought through all of those strategies, and I won't give everything about where we came out, but it was a very difficult exercise because it's a very difficult problem. But we asked ourselves fundamental questions, and we came to a particular answer, which I'll share with you later. Let's talk about now. What's going on now? Now, as we speak, the freeze is off at Yongbyon. So that facility that was frozen since 1994 is now unfrozen. North Korea's kicked the inspectors out, and it is within their power, if they choose, to get that 5 or 6 bombs worth of plutonium and begin the serial production of nuclear weapons. Sound familiar? It is familiar. That's exactly where we were in the summer of 1994. Can we attack Yongbyon? You bet we can. What happens if you attack Yongbyon? Same thing. You get an awfully big war. That's where we are now. One little extra twist to it. It develops that since 1994, the North Koreans, despite the fact that Yongbyon was frozen, were not inactive in their nuclear program. They learned what my students know, which is that you can make nuclear weapons out of 2 metals. Plutonium's one, and if that path's blocked, there's another one called uranium. And this fall, the Bush administration confronted North Korea with evidence that's been accumulating over a few years that they were enriching uranium. And what did they say? They said, well, yeah, actually, we are. We have been. And that came as a pretty big shock to an administration that was already deeply suspicious of North Korea, had branded it a member of the axis of evil. President Bush is quoted in Bob Woodward's book as saying he loathes Kim Jong-il, which can't possibly read well in North Korea. Now, Kim Jong-il got back at him by saying that Bush should behave more like Clinton, which I'm sure was equally insulting to the current president. But at any rate, as the barbs go back and forth and Yongbyon is unfrozen, and the Bush administration finds itself where we were in 1998, namely, what do we do with this place, this odd historical throwback in a certain sense, but which is not ignorable because it's doing something that is not ignorable, namely taking itself to the edge of developing weapons of mass destruction. That's the dilemma we are trying to dissect and illuminate this evening, and we couldn't have a better panel to help us do that. Let me introduce them from my immediate left on over. To my immediate left, his face familiar to you from the television last night, which cut to his, see, there's no North Korean ambassador to the United States because we don't have diplomatic relations. So when President Bush talked about North Korea in his speech, who else to put on the screen, at least CNN, which I was watching, but His Excellency Yang Sun-chol, who is ambassador of the Republic of South Korea to Washington. Before that, a distinguished legislator in the Korean National Assembly, vice chair of the Unification and Foreign Affairs Committee. So someone who deeply knowledgeable about the government of the ROK's views on these issues, and also someone very comfortable in a setting like this. A political scientist by training, a doctoral degree, the author of several books on Korean issues, including North and South Korean Political Systems, a Comparative Analysis. To his left, the dean, now dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts, Steve Bosworth, one of the America's most distinguished diplomats, ambassador to Tunisia, Philippines, and finally the Republic of Korea from 1997 to 2000. A policy thinker, director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, the sort of brainy job in the diplomatic arena. First director of something called KEDO, which was the organization set up after 1994 when that agreement I mentioned was concluded to implement the agreement. Steve Bosworth sent off to do that. Also a scholar at heart, has taught at Columbia and is now running the Fletcher School. To his left, General John Tillelly, now in the midst of a distinguished business career as President and COO of Cyprus International. Before that, he was President and CEO of the USO. A long and distinguished career in the United States Army, commanded the 1st Cavalry Division in Desert Storm, was Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and many other things. But for our purposes, most importantly, if John looks really smart, it's because his head has had to fill 4 hats at one time. He was commander of the U.S. Army forces in South Korea. He was commander of U.S. Forces Korea. He was commander of the Combined Forces Command, which is the U.S. South Korea standing coalition deterring North Korea. And this tells you how many layers of history there are in this part of the world. He was commander-in-chief of the United Nations Command, because it was the United Nations Command under which U.S. forces fought in the war that ended not with a treaty or a true peace, but only with an armistice 50 years ago this year. John Tillelly wore all those hats and was the principal American responsible both for attacks on Yongbyon and what to do with the horrible sequel to that. Let me, what we're going to do is I'm going to pose some questions to them, and I might even pipe in myself on occasion if I feel provoked, and then we're going to spend a good deal of the time taking questions from the floor. Let me start by asking the 3 of you, and I'll ask you, Mr. Ambassador, first. From the very top line perspective, what's the future of North Korea? How long can this place keep on keeping on? Isolated, Stalinist, and what do you think North Korea's leadership strategy is for rescuing a country that is starving and has no or few friends in the world?
That's a tough question.
It is the tough question, but it's yours.
First of all,
and then subsequently, these 2 guys can think about it while you're answering it.
First of all, I'm so happy to be here. Last time I was here for Axis of Evil, North Korea. And this year I was, as you know, I was at the Congress last night, and at least no more that phrase mentioned. And even though short notice, I just came here because I have such esteemed friend like General Tirari and my friend Steve. So I said, why not? So I came. And,
glad you did.
And then you suddenly give me this very big question. And actually, we were very optimistic, to be frank with you, until 2 years ago. That until President Kim Dae-jung assumed the power in 1998, North Korea was most isolated countries in the world, even more isolated than Albania during the heydays of communism. But under President Kim Dae-jung, his leadership and vision, that North Korea, we encouraged also. Before, all Republic Korean government policy was to discourage friends and allies to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea. But we encouraged them, actively encouraged them. As a result of it, some 19 countries made diplomatic relations with North Korea, including 13 out of 15 EU nations. And of course, North Korea is in big economic troubles. And I'm sure you also watch North Korea, that if there was a consistent signal coming from North Korea, it was to engage and open up the country. But we have to have some empathy to North Korea because it has been isolated, regimented, regulated as one of the worst regimented regime in the world. And then they tried to get out of that box or, whatever you call it, isolation. And then here we are. So, but even for the last 2 years, if there is one consistent signal we get from North Korea, is that North Korea tried to get out of that isolation. Because they made so many unprecedented acts. Let me just give you 4. One was that last summer, even though failure aside, they tried to introduce market systems. They make wages more real and the prices of rice and grains more real to the price. So at least they tried to sort of introduce market systems or price mechanisms to North Korea. And surprisingly that we had second naval incident in West Sea or Yellow Sea we call. And North Korea made formal regret directly to Korea. In 50 years they have never done it. And you recall that Prime Minister of Japan, Koizumi, for the first time visited North Korea. Inviting him itself is quite unprecedented. But after he was invited, Kim Jong-il formally apologized for Japanese citizens' abductees. That was also very unprecedented. So if you look at this certain pattern of their behaviors, even including Jim Kelly's Assistant Secretary's visit to Pyongyang, it's a quite unprecedented behavior. Is it try to be confrontational? Maybe not. So maybe we should read these signals. If war is not an option here, then we should read this signal with more caution, more prudence, I think.
Steve, how do you read the signals?
Well, people have spent a lifetime trying to detect what's going on in North Korea, and no one has been very successful. As I said earlier to you privately, Ash, you're trying to construct a very detailed portrait on the basis of 3 data points on a screen, because we know so little about what happens there and how decisions are made, even to some extent by whom they are made. My view is that North Korea must change in order to survive, but it fears that if it does change, it won't survive. They are truly on the horns of an awful dilemma, because to change the economic system requires that in one manner or another, they open it up, that they become much more connected to the outside world, even if that's only through enterprise zones of the sort that the Chinese employed in the early 80s. Yet that increased contact with the outside world will inevitably erode the totalitarian nature of the regime and its hold over people. So I think they've got a very difficult proposition. Now, I would argue that at various times the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration had a North Korean policy which consisted largely of waiting for it to collapse. Now, it may well be that North Korea will collapse. That's not what China wants, and it's certainly not what South Korea wants. But so far that hasn't. And simply waiting for it to collapse is not a policy. It does not tell you how to deal with things such as we now face with regard to the nuclear issue. It doesn't tell you what to do about humanitarian food aid. It doesn't tell you how to do a lot of things. It is politically, in domestic political context, it's the easiest option because it doesn't require that you make any thorny or difficult decisions. You can simply say, as Clinton said in a manner of speaking, and as certainly George Bush said, we aren't going to deal with these guys because they're too erratic, they're too crazy, and they're loathsome. But that, it seems to me, is not a very responsible position to put this country in, certainly not a very responsible position to put our ally, South Korea, in. And our unwillingness to construct what would be a policy of substance toward North Korea until recently has, I think, caused great strain in the U.S.-South Korean relationship. My own view is that the first thing that we should concentrate on is repairing the strain in that relationship, because unless we and South Korea have a common set of goals and an agreed strategy for dealing with the North that includes an allocation of individual responsibilities among ourselves, the ROK, and Japan, the North Koreans will simply play us for fools, as they are now, largely because we are not dealing with them in a unified fashion. That brings us back to where you started, but let me stop there. Only to say, finally, having been in North Korea a couple of times, and having dealt with North Koreans extensively while I was running what you call keto, what I used to call Cato.
Your accent is grave.
I think we make a mistake when we analyze them simply on the basis of sort of political science or even political economy. There is an ideological element in that regime which has very little to do with Stalinism or communism. I sometimes compare the North Korean regime to a cult, and they are almost the heaven's gate of international politics. We should not underestimate the extent to which these people, poor and deprived and starving that they are, feel, because they've been taught this since birth, a real sense of attachment to that regime. Now, I don't think that's never going to stop, but it is a reality, and we can't simply say, well, we will go in there and liberate them. That's not what they necessarily are looking for.
In fact, an important pillar of their ideology is self-reliance.
That's right.
And that means if the rest of the world is out to get you and surrounds you, that's a perfectly comfortable notion within their
It also
ideology.
means, though, that they have no shame or guilt regarding how they deal with the outside world. And when I was running Cato, I used to complain to my North Korean counterparts that they treated Cato like an ATM machine. And any occasion they could squeeze some cash out of us, they would try to do so, regardless of the principles involved.
General Tillelli, on the military side, what have you seen over the last 6 years or so, since 1998, when we first started to talk about military contingencies there? And what do you see in the way of a military option? Is there a military option?
Let me just say a couple things, just to give you my thoughts on what the ambassadors have said. And I'll make 4 quick points. One, I do not ascribe to a collapse scenario. They have been in a negative economically for over a decade, and they're accustomed to deprivation, starvation, progressive malnutrition, disease. Steve used the word cult. I would also use the word cult as you think about that philosophy. One piece that I think, in my view, and this is my personal view, that as Ford's job number 1 is quality, North Korea's regime job number 1 is to stay in power. So in my view, this prevents an awful lot of the good things that might occur. Lastly, they have been masters of missing opportunity. So the consequence, and you can start with the policy review that former Secretary of Defense Perry and a very good team, and you can walk your way down all of the things that have been done that would be considered positively for North Korea, an opportunity that they had or have to move forward, and they've missed that opportunity. On the military side, first of all, no one wants crisis or conflict. Certainly those of us in the military do not, or we're in the military. Secondarily, dialogue is most important. Communication is always more important than crisis and conflict, and will get you a better outcome. Thirdly, in North Korea and South Korea, you suffer what I call a tyranny of proximity. And as you look at the demilitarized zone, and you look at the array of weaponry on the northern side of the demilitarized zone, most of those weapons can reach the major population area of Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea. So it would be very devastating. They have improved over time those capabilities. They have improved over time what I will call their missile technology. Ash spoke about the Taepodong firing in 1998, but there are lots and lots of missiles that can rain havoc not only on the Republic of Korea but also in the region. Thirdly, they proliferate those missiles, as we saw in the ship that was seized on the high seas, had missiles, and other cases which we will not discuss. And lastly, they have weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological capability, and some number potentially of nuclear capability, ill-described. So in that context, if you take the word of the leader, Kim Jong-il, where he says his philosophy is military first, and you've got to separate a lot of rhetoric that comes out of North Korea, military first philosophy. Much of the constrained resources go to the military and military means because, in my view, they uphold the regime and they are presently the last instrument of national power that Kim Jong-il has. So that's what I see on the North Korean military side.
Interesting. Thank you, John. And I want to come back to the question of weapons of mass destruction in a while, because Secretary of State Powell a few weeks ago kind of took my breath away by sort of implying that maybe if North Korea obtained nuclear weapons, that was okay, which I disagree with totally. I want to return to that in a moment. On the issue, and ask you, John, to comment on that, I'll say something about that as well. I'm going to get back to the relationship between the United States and South Korea, because that has been a problem over the last couple of years. There's a lot of blame to go around on all sides, but the problem where we find ourselves is that our governments and our publics are not together. And we always felt when we were doing the North Korea policy review, and John and Steve can remember that whatever else we did, we couldn't be successful. No American policy could be successful in the Korean Peninsula unless it had the support of South Korea, and also Japan for that matter, for the simple reason that when we worked together, we were much more effective. If we worked to different purposes, we would undercut one another and we would not be effective. And still, most importantly, we had to stand shoulder to shoulder for deterrence, which is the bedrock of everything, to work. But things are in a bad way now. There's a new president in South Korea. He has some new ideas. There's a relatively new president in the United States. He had some new ideas when he came into office. There was an incident in which some young girls were killed in a Army training incident. So things are at a bad ebb. And to the two ambassadors, what do we do at this stage to patch things up between South Korea and the United States, if I'm right that a precondition, whatever we make up our minds about as a strategy, can't be effective unless it's a shared strategy of the two allies?
Well, I very much agree with the proposition. I think that unfortunately what has happened over the last year and a half is that the United States having been for 50 years seen as one key to the deterrence of North Korea and important fundamentally to the ultimate reconciliation between North and South Korea. Instead of being seen as part of the solution, now for an important segment of the South Korean population, we're seen as part of the problem. That began, I think, with a very unfortunate first meeting between President Bush and President Kim Dae-jung, in which basically South Korea received the impression that President Bush considered South Korea and their president to be naive for dealing with North Korea on the basis that he was then dealing with them. And that, I think, had very unfortunate consequences and repercussions. The axis of evil formulation did not help. First of all, no one could really explain what that meant and what its implications were. But it contributed to a perception in South Korea that basically the United States has a very hard-line posture toward North Korea and was no longer supportive of South Korea's historic shift in seeking to lower tensions, promote ultimately some form of reconciliation. And I think that's attributable to something that we didn't pay enough attention to. And that is during the 97-98 economic crisis and the coming to office of Kim Dae-jung, I think South Korea, the majority of South Koreans came together behind the proposition that while they wanted peace and they didn't want war, and while they wanted reconciliation with North Korea, they didn't really want North Korea to collapse in the near term, and they didn't want to take on the enormous social economic costs of dealing with a collapsed North Korea. And we still seem to be trying to promote the collapse of North Korea. So it's not surprising that our two governments seem out of sync. Now, what do we do about it? I think the first thing we have to do about it is start listening as well as talking. My impression is that the new president of South Korea very much desires good relations with the United States. It's politically untenable in the medium term, frankly, for any president of South Korea to have bad relations with the United States. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work for Korea and it doesn't work for the United States, but we have a stake in that. So I think we have to start listening. We have to begin to have clear ideas about what we are willing to do, what we are not willing to do. We can't start by saying we want a diplomatic solution, but we're not willing to talk to North Korea. Diplomacy consists largely of talking. That's the whole point. So I think that we have to start listening. We have to try to lower the rhetoric both toward North Korea and to some extent toward South Korea. I think John can speak to this more effectively than I can, but I think over time, not in a precipitate fashion, but over time, we have to reposition ourselves a little bit there militarily. I think, and John and I have had long discussions about this, I think it has long made little sense for us to have our military headquarters right smack in the middle of downtown Seoul. So I think the situation can be dealt with. I think we have to both, the U.S. and South Korea, sort of pause and draw a deep breath. When I was in South Korea last week, someone said to me that the problem is that South Koreans in an emotional moment said things that they don't really believe, and Americans believed them. And I think there's something to that. And I think the new president very much wants to have a good relationship with Washington.
Well, let me just add that I basically agree with Steve, but I like to distinguish country-to-country relations and people-to-people relations with administration-to-government relations. And if you differentiate that, then I think American and Korean relations are one of the best, most enduring relationship. And people-to-people relations too, that majority of the Koreans are still very grateful and appreciative of what America has done all these years, going more than a half a century. But at a given time, particular administration comes in, either in Korea or in the US, with a particular ideological leaning, pursuing a particular policy, may differ from the counterpart. That's the kind of a situation we have here. So I'm not really fundamentally worrying about the current anti-American sentiment. It's true also that the fundamental demographic change we have to mutually understand. That is, in Korea now, almost 82% of the Korean population are the post-Korean generations. They are highly educated, extremely assertive and independent, and IT friendly, and mostly brought up in the urban setting, 80%, more than 80. They are sort of, I'm sure some of you went to Korea that you realize that so many apartment forests, and they grew up there. So they are very different generations. And also Koreans must understand the shocks and the horrors of 9/11, the kind of American feelings and American situations, because it's a mutual empathy is needed here. And also that one more point, that is as if the current anti-American demonstrations are very new to American people, but our memory is very short. If you look at the Korean demonstration, it goes back for decades. When I was a student, I also demonstrated too. But at that time, it was very vague, and also kind of military dictatorship is there, and somehow Koreans erroneously or whatever believe that maybe America is behind it or something. So you can see when the dictatorship was in high pitch, the Korean student demonstrations are very radical. I mean, some of you remember that students occupied USIS building in Seoul, Daegu, Gwangju, Busan, set fire, and then sometimes destroy the the facilities. And one time, some radical students intruded into U.S. ambassador's residence. But what you see today is that demonstrations are very violent then, very, very violent and radical. But now, demonstrations are fundamentally peaceful. For instance, the candlelight demonstrations were peaked to about 50,000, but there was no major violence or incidents. It's true that some burned U.S. flags and things like that. And also the issue specific. That is, maybe there is a kind of environmental problem related to U.S. Military facilities, or the incident of 2 Korean middle school girls killed and things like that. Very issue specific, very peaceful. So once again, that in short, that Korean-American relations are one of the most enduring and one of the most model, exemplar relations. And people-to-people relations are also very good ones. So I'm not really worrying about it.
Let me press you, before I throw the floor open, all of us. Now, what's the bottom line of where we've come to so far? We have, let me just do the tally here. I believe Steve said that waiting for North Korea to collapse was not a strategy. I believe Ambassador Yang said that North Korea might not collapse but slowly reform itself, but that was a very slow process. It's not on the time scale of what's happening at Yongbyon. John Tillelly said, and I would certainly say that while we can take out Yongbyon, the consequences of that are very unpleasant to contemplate. So where does that leave us? Steve, you said that left us talking. We agreed that if we talked, we had to talk with one voice with our South Korean allies. What's your recommendation now? And I'm going to ask you to make a recommendation to the U.S. government as well, if I could. I'll start with you, Steve. What should they be doing now? And oh, I'm sorry, there's one other option, which I took off the table subconsciously. It gives Steve a little more time to think here, which is let them have the nukes. What's wrong with that? I think that that would be a disaster for American policy. That would be a setback and a major defeat for the United States and for South Korea as well. And you can just count the reasons. The first is that if North Korea had nuclear weapons, they may come to think that they could win or could avoid losing a war on the Korean Peninsula, and that may make such a war more likely. Second, if North Korea goes nuclear, that starts other people thinking thoughts you don't want them thinking. It starts South Korea wondering, well, what about us and the bomb? And there was a South Korean nuclear program, many of you may know, at one time. Japan, Taiwan, make that all the way around the world. What does the non-proliferation regime mean if the world's strangest, most isolated country goes nuclear and nobody pays any attention? And finally, if North Korea does collapse, we have the same problem that we had when the USSR collapsed, which is nukes on the loose. And who gets them after that? The successor government, or do they get out? Do they get to terrorists or someone else? So for all these reasons, I emphasize this because we oughtn't to take it as obvious, and because our Secretary of State seemed to be a little wobbly on this question a few weeks ago. I think that letting North Korea go nuclear is also not an option. A big setback, big defeat for American policy and our policy in the region. So that leaves us, I suppose, with some sort of dialogue. What's the content of that dialogue? Steve, you first.
Well, I think you have to come to grips with the fact that you have to look at what North Korea wants, at least what it says it wants. And its number one demand is from the United States some assurance, some formal assurance in some fashion, that we are not going to attack them. Now, we think, for all the reasons that we've been discussing tonight, that the notion of a U.S. attack on North Korea is ridiculous. But what they really want is a lifting of what they perceive to be an American threat to their survival. Now, we don't have to guarantee their survival, but what we would have to do, I think, is to basically issue, again, in a more formal fashion, a statement of non-hostile intent. Now, I think that the only answer to this is to do a bigger 1994 agreement and formalize engagement. My view is that the only option, and I recognize people say, well, that's blackmail and extortion, and, so what? It won't be the first time we paid people and countries not to do things we didn't want them to do. We do it all the time. And I think we should just face up to that. I think our goal should be to give North Korea such a stake and interest in its connections with the outside world, particularly South Korea, to some extent Japan, and to some extent China, that its temptation to cheat on a nuclear agreement is greatly, greatly reduced. I don't think verification is necessarily the answer. It's a country with 8,000 caves and tunnels, and you can put a lot of stuff in there. But I think you have to begin to change the balance of interests and incentives and disincentives on the part of the North Koreans. Now, the irony of the current situation for the Bush administration is that it had the opportunity to continue implementing a package which it had characterized as Bill Clinton's blackmail payoff. Now it's probably going to have to negotiate its own package, which will have George W. Bush's name all over it. I'm not sure that made great political sense for them, but that's the situation they've gotten themselves in.
General Tillelly, your advice at this juncture?
I agree with Ambassador Bosworth, with one exception. There has been a pattern of behavior over time in signing of agreements that have been essentially violated. In my view, there has to be some sort of a verification regime. Now, how intrusive that is, what that regime is, whether it's done by IAEA, whether it's patterned based on some of the things we did with the Soviet bloc, and how that occurs where you have transparency. I think there has to be transparency because of the pattern of behavior over time. There has been, if you say, and I don't know if this is a good thesis, that the agreed framework was a good deal, and they violated that deal. They violated the 1991 baseline agreement. They violated the UN Charter, the NPT. I think there has to be something that tells us that, and it does not have to be as intrusive as one might think, that tells us that we've got it about right this time, because we can't afford to have it wrong.
Right. Steve, very briefly
Very
on
briefly,
that.
I'm not against verification. My only point is that verification by itself is not sufficient to assure that they won't cheat. So you need to change the balance of incentives and disincentives. One final point. For us, the 94 agreement was a nuclear for nuclear agreement. For North Korea, it was a political agreement. They didn't, their particular goal was not to obtain light water reactors from Cato. Their goal was to normalize their political relationship with the United States. And that clearly didn't happen. And the U.S., both Clinton and Bush administrations, should take some of the blame, credit, whatever for that. So should North Korea. They were, responsible in many respects for the lack of progress also. But it was a political agreement. It was not a nuclear agreement for them.
Ambassador Yang, you want to give a little bit of advice to your host government?
Well, I mean, I'm not in a position to that openly, but
We won't tell anybody.
well, let me just mention.
We'll all take a vow of silence here.
We'll only send the film.
My
that's all.
government's official position on North Korea's nuclear issue is this, that under no circumstances we allow North Korea having a nuclear weapons program, whether it's uranium or plutonium. That's just period. I mean, unfortunately, too, that President-elect Roh Moo-hyun has the same basic position that under no circumstances Korea can afford a nuclear weapons peninsula. That's period. And then we tried to, as you recall, that in Los Cabos, Mexico, last October, 3 leaders met. That is Koizumi and Bush and President Kim, and they agreed that we tried to resolve it peacefully and diplomatically. And I was so assured yesterday that at the State of Union message, he mentioned that different threat requires different strategies. And I all agree with Steve and General Tilelli that we need to get back to talk. And so far that the U.S. government is trying to give documented security assurance to North Korea, and that's a kind of a very good start. So I hope that North Korea get this constructive initiative made by the United States openly, and that North Korea should respond to this positive response.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions from the floor. If you'd approach the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question. Don't make a statement, ask a question, please. And let's start with this gentleman right here.
Good evening. My name is Alexander Rossolimo. I'm president of Strategy Associates International. 2 months ago, the Wall Street Journal had he carried the following cryptic, excuse me, but ominous one-sentence news item on its front page. Quote, U.S. intelligence is looking for signs that North Korea will conduct a flight test of a ballistic missile that may be capable of carrying a nuclear warhead to American soil, end of quote. My question is, how close is North Korea to be able to strike the U.S. with a nuclear device?
John Tilelli?
That is a difficult question to answer. I will say that the Taepodong missile that was fired on August 31st of 1998, when I was commander-in-chief there, was a missile that had long-range capability. And in my personal view, I think they have been continuing development of their intercontinental ballistic missile program. How close they are, because of all the things you've heard, North Korea is a closed society, human intelligence is lacking, and national means only can give you so much information. So to make an assessment, I think, would be foolhardy, but in my view, in my assessment, they are continuing to develop long-range missile capability that could have intercontinental ballistic means.
Thank you.
And oh, by the way, and I say this and it's gratuitous, if anyone thinks you build mid-range missiles or long-range missiles to put a high explosive warhead in them, I think that's a waste of time and money. You build these long-range or mid-range missiles to put weapons of mass destruction, whether it be chemical, biological, or nuclear capability.
This gentleman right here.
Another thing occurred in 1994 in the history of this problem, I think, and that is the Republicans came to power in Congress and stopped funding the commitments, quid pro quo commitments that were made by our government relative to the Korean problem and solving it. I wonder, well, number one, why you don't mention that in your chronology, and number two, what do you think that particular decision by the Republicans has done relative to leading us to now?
Well, I'll say that. I'll take a crack at that first, and then Steve Bosworth. You're absolutely right. The agreed framework immediately came under attack in 1994 before the ink was dry, and the Clinton administration was on the defensive about it, and therefore construed it, I think it's fair to say, and Steve Bosworth, I think, was alluding to this, in the narrowest possible way, namely, you freeze Yongbyon, we will do our oil shipments, which was the quid pro quo in the first phase, and all the rest of it, which was about normalizing relations between North and South Korea, even building them the 2 reactors. I think on the American side, it became less and less plausible that we were going to do everything that was in the agreement. And as the decade wore on, people recognized that the agreement was in trouble. So Republicans, Democrats, whoever was elected now, this agreement was unpopular on the American scene immediately because it seemed to be, it was dealing with, it wasn't called the axis of evil then, but it's a very malodorous government. And dealing with that government was unpopular at the time, and we began to retreat from the larger vision of the agreement, which may have been more important to North Korea. No question about it. Now, of course, we now know that they were simultaneously undermining or cheating on the agreement, so their fealty to it was not 100% either. Steve, you want to add anything to that?
I think, you know, it's almost too easy just to blame the Republicans for all of these things. But I think the Democrats, and with all respect, the Clinton administration, merit substantial criticism because they were unwilling to expend any political energy in defending the agreed framework and trying to obtain funding for it, and they certainly were unwilling to take on the political challenge of moving along a path toward normalization in any fashion. And when I was dealing with the North Koreans through Cato, it was quite obvious that they were profoundly concerned that the agreement they thought was going to lay out a roadmap to normalization with the United States was not doing that. And they then, of course, began doing things which made it almost certain it wouldn't do that. So I think it's unfortunate because it was the first major engagement between North Korea and the outside world. And I think we had a strong interest in convincing North Korea that they could rely on the outside world for full compliance. And it changes attitudes.
Yes.
Yeah, I know, I can see that. This gentleman first, though, please.
Yeah, I'm Kelly Fujiyoshi, a graduate of the Kennedy School. This was touched on briefly, President Bush's comments calling North Korea part of the axis of evil. Could you elaborate further whether you feel that those comments helped or hurt resolve the crisis with North Korea?
Who's this addressed to? Anyone in particular?
Maybe, I'm not sure if maybe there's different viewpoints on this.
Since it's a question about the American administration, I'll start with the 2 Americans and spare you commenting on our political situation. Ambassador Bosworth.
Well, I think it was a hollow phrase. It didn't have any meaning to it. other than perhaps these were all three countries that we had suspicions of in terms of trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. That's about the only common denominator I can see. I mean, I don't want to be in a position of seeming to defend Kim Jong-il's regime. It's a vile regime, but it is where it is, and we don't have the ability to change it. I think the axis of evil formulation was frankly political grandstanding, and I suspect there are many in the administration, perhaps even including the president, who wishes they'd never put that in the State of the Union speech.
When we went to North Korea in 2000, Bill Perry, that was the first time there had been an American presidential envoy in North Korea in 50 years. And we sort of laid out our view of North Korea and the world. The sentence the North Koreans liked best was a sentence that has since been published, which was the United States must deal with the North Korea as we, I forget exactly the word, but as we find it, rather than as we wish it was. And the North Koreans really liked that sentence because we're dealing with them as they are. When they hear the axis of evil, they hear these guys are out to get us, to change our regime. And therein lies, I think, the seed of the decision you have to make about an American strategy towards North Korea. Are you prepared, if they gave up with weapons of mass destruction, are you prepared to leave them alone? Odious, whatever you want to say, vile as they may be, are you prepared to live with that situation? What we told them was, you can just keep on keeping on here, and that's fine, but not if you have weapons of mass destruction. But when you call them the axis of evil, you seem to be saying, no matter what you do, we're out to get you. And that confuses the signal. So you need to make up your mind, are you out to get them, or are you not out to get them?
Good evening. My name is Robin Pendoli. I'm from the Graduate School of Education. The London Guardian over the past month has been reporting that, as was mentioned earlier, North Korea has been requesting, it's one of their primary requests in the negotiations, to have what the Guardian was calling a pact of non-aggression with the United States. They've also been reporting that the United States has been saying that they won't sign this pact, but they will sign a written guarantee. I was hoping that someone on the panel, I don't know whom, but someone on the panel would be able to make the political distinction for me and also tell me whether or not there's either an official or non-official position on the part of the other governments that are participating in the negotiation process at this point: China, Japan, Russia, and South Korea.
Okay, that clearly goes to Steve Bosworth. I hope there's a short answer to that question. Sounds like a legalistic one in part.
I think the problem is that the phrase non-aggression pact smacks too much of the various agreements that were put in place to little purpose after World War I, before World War II. No one really wants to do that. And also, you could construe that perhaps as something that would require Senate approval in the United States, and I don't think any administration would want to take that to the U.S. Senate. That being said, I think there are ways in which, and this is what diplomacy is all about, there are ways in which you can harden the current statements by the United States in a way that come across as having real content and give it some formal character. As for the other countries concerned, basically they just want this thing to be solved. They don't really care that much what the U.S., how the U.S. formulates this statement of non-hostile intent. But we then would expect that they would be doing things as well.
My name is Orijit Sengupta. I'm at the business school. In the last few months, there have been some pretty credible reports about some kind of a barter going on between Pakistan and North Korea with, I give you nukes and you give me missiles, that kind of stuff going on. One is a great ally of the U.S. as stated by the U.S. government. The other is on the axis of evil. How do you kind of reconcile this situation? And this is open to everyone, actually.
All right, well, let me start with John Tillelli.
I think we have to look at it in the context of, do we believe North Korea proliferates? And what do they get in return? And I think there has been sufficient evidence that they proliferate their missile technology. And if you follow that logic train, you would assume that they would get either cash for that technology or some other technology. So whether or not there is a direct link or a non-direct link to that thought. I think we can make the case pretty clearly that North Korea does proliferate their missiles, does share their missile technology, and does get other technologies in return.
One comment on that also. But for 9/11, the axis of evil might have included Pakistan. But Pakistan, our relationship with Pakistan did a 180 after 9/11. But during the time when our relations with Pakistan were very chilly, Pakistan, like North Korea, like Iraq, like Iran, they all get to sort of an international brotherhood of rogues. And since they can't deal with anyone else, they do deal with one another, and there's an active commerce and bad stuff.
The other thing I would say is, since the Juche philosophy of self-reliance has failed as far as crops, missiles are the cash crop for North Korea.
Sure.
Mark Caprio from the Korea Institute. Thank you for a very enlightening discussion. In 1999, Benjamin Gilman put together a report on Korea. I think it was right after the Perry report, maybe the Republicans' answer, I'm not sure. But in that report, he mentioned that North Korea was conducting uranium processing and said that this was okay as far as your agreed framework is concerned. Now, Kelly went and they admitted they were doing this, and it's a violation. Are we talking about different things here, or what's going on here?
Steve?
All the time that I was involved in this, I think there were many of us who were suspicious that North Korea was probably doing something, keeping alive some kind of nuclear-related program, if only because, as it turned out, they would want to have some sort of a negotiating chip, something that they could put on the table to get our attention. So, no, I think it's the same program. Where the Gilman information came from originally, it's not all that useful to speculate, but it is not allowable under the agreed framework if you interpret the agreed framework as I would think most international lawyers would interpret it. It does not specifically mention uranium enrichment in the body of the agreement, but in the preamble it cites the 1991 ROK North Korean agreement, which specifically prohibits uranium enrichment. The agreed framework itself only talks about graphite moderated technology, which is what they were playing around with to produce plutonium.
It's interesting, Gilman wasn't the only one who made that mistake. Many people thought, because we began to construe the agreed framework more and more narrowly every year, that it was only a plutonium agreement, and obviously they'd go uranium. Sir.
Prior to President Bush's 2001 State of the Union address, it seemed that President Kim Jong-il was on somewhat of a charm offensive, and I seem to remember there was even talk of reduction of missile program or a nuclear program being arranged more through Russia than through the United States. Since the speech, however, it seems that both America and Korea have sort of entrenched themselves into a hostile stance. Do you think, and I would like both an American and a South Korean response, that a successful endgame to the nuclear crisis we see right now will more likely result from U.S. action and more of a pact like you outlined, stronger 1994, or U.S. backing off and letting regional powers try to arrange this with the United States taking an active role of silence, pretty much?
Ambassador Yang, what do you think is the best choreography here?
I'm not sure how. Would you repeat more specifically what the question is? Yeah.
Is a better strategy to pursue the U.S. actively trying to resolve this, or the U.S. trying to let the powers around Japan, South Korea, and Russia resolve it, while the United States is very clearly out of the way so that the rhetorical missiles that have been fired already can be diffused?
The Bush administration has been seeming to say, well, we're not going to deal with this yucky situation, and so we're letting the Russians, the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the Japanese deal with it. And I think the question is, can that work?
Well, there is an assumption that North Korea's nuclear issue is not just between the U.S. and North Korean issue, but it's a regional issue as well as international issue. But if you too much focus on international aspect of North Korean nuclear issue, then inter-Korean sort of negotiations or activities concerning that issue, or U.S. and the North Korean interaction on that issue, there is a potential of being marginalized, and also that North Korea may not like that or may not buy that track, that is international track. Yeah. Am I answering your question?
Yes.
John, you wanted an American perspective.
The only thing I would say is, and I used to say in my bad Korean when I used to talk to the Korean Alliance, kachi kapshida, which means we go together. And the fact is, the best solution is a we go together solution between the ROC, the U.S., and those interested regional parties. And that is the way, in my view, personal view, that you not only come up with a solution that is agreeable to all parties. Secondly, you're going down the same azimuth, down the same road to the solution. And thirdly, it's one that might stick over time, rather than one that is U.S. only, ROC only, Japan only, Russia, China being the broker. I think you have to have a concerted effort to come up with a policy with our great allies, the Republic of Korea and the United States and the regional partners.
My name's Hannon Carroll. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. My question is similar to his. It's a follow-up. But recently in the New York Times, there was an article that South Koreans were growing a relationship with China, and that relationship was growing, as well as North Korea being a natural ally with China. What do you feel is China's actual relationship in this crisis?
I think this is in part an answer to the earlier question as well as to yours. I think one of the consequences of the U.S. deciding that it is not going to be directly engaged in solving the problem of North Korea and the nuclear issue is that we would lose a strategic position within the region, or at least our position would be weakened. I think it's important to remember that the rise of China economically changes the whole constellation in Northeast Asia. And the countries of Northeast Asia are, because they must, adjusting to that shift in the constellation. And if we want to continue to play a role of stabilizing force for protecting U.S. interests in Northeast Asia, which I think are very considerable, then I think we've got to be directly engaged. I don't see China as a competitor or as an enemy in any way, but I think that the inevitable consequence of our trying to stay outside the action on North Korea because we don't want to deal with these nasty guys would be to accelerate the trend toward Chinese influence, greater Chinese influence in Northeast Asia.
I've met with Jiang Zemin 6 times to discuss North Korea, most recently just 2 months ago, and never, ever has he or Chen Jichen or any of his advisors tried to grab the action from the Americans. I think that the Chinese know that the North Koreans really value what the Americans are saying, and you can't hide them. You can't hide a bad American attitude towards North Korea behind anyone else. So the Chinese have never tried to grab the action. Parenthetically, they've never, to my way of thinking, been terribly helpful either. They share our views largely of North Korea, and we've asked them again and again to lean on the North Koreans and gotten very little out of them. Sir.
My name is Howard Lee, the MPA program, Kennedy School. I have 2 questions. One question for to the ambassadors, one question to the General Tillery. First of all,
I'm sorry, pick one. We've got a lot of other people who want to ask questions. Sorry.
Yes.
I hate to do this because he's an advisee of mine and a great student, but pick one.
It seems that the United States is getting ready to talk with North Korea eventually. So my question is, so if the North Korea do not comply, what should be done? What is the red line? And the second question is, in 1994, sorry, the United States made their preemptive actions.
Never listens to me.
Okay, preemptive actions against North Korea.
He was
and
born in
it
North
makes
Korea, I think.
South Koreans are very furious. after it revealed by Dawn Overdeveloper. So, General Tillery, do you think the Bush administration should make preemptive actions without any consultation with South Korea?
All right, John, why don't you answer both of those? Where's the red line, and what about preemption?
One, I don't think you can have define a red line right now. There are certain things we have to be concerned about, and that's once they start leaching plutonium in Yongbyon, I think we have to be concerned about that because it's very easy to move and hide and proliferate, sell, whatever. Secondly, I think I will go back to the answer that Ash Carter talked about earlier on, and that is when you think about a preemptive action without our ally involvement, I think that's a frivolous thought. That's a stray electron that some people talk about and like to write about. We are in this together. The solution for North Korea is with South Korea and the United States and those regional partners. And secondly, when you think about any sort of preemption, in my view, as a senior military person who worked very closely with the allies and with the leadership of the Republic of Korea, there are second and third level consequences that none of us like to think about. You're 30 miles away from the demilitarized zone, and you've got 13 million people living in Seoul. And you've got lots of these apartment forests that the ambassador talks about. So the fact is in my view, we do nothing without our ally, and we do nothing without our great partners, the Republic of Korea.
Good evening. My name is Mark Falvey. I'm a student of International Security Studies and Military History at UMass. General, hoo-ah, sir. First
Hoo-ah.
half all the way.
First team.
This question is to you, sir.
Great.
In my limited studies of the region, it seems to me that for all the bellicose talk that we hear coming out of North Korea and all the verbal diarrhea, if I may, nobody has talked from their side about U.S. presence in the South. All we have heard about that and the complaints comes from the South Korean public, the people that elected this last president. Are we still wanted there, and are we still needed there? The arguments that we are there to assure...
That's good enough.
Okay, thank you.
We're
Thank you,
get
sir.
one more question and we're out of time.
First, I think you've got to separate rhetoric and protest from reality. In my view, the people of the Republic of Korea are the most gracious people I've ever met in the world, and they do want American forces there, for the most part. Secondarily, it would be, I think, foolish for me not to say that, just as Steve mentioned early on, there are some things that we have to do to make our host more happy with our presence there. And the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea just signed a land partnership plan that will move the footprint, change the footprint. I think one statement you made is somewhat incorrect. One of the things that the North Korean regime has wanted forever is the removal of U.S. forces from the Republic of Korea. Now, are we needed there? I think we're needed for a number of reasons. One, we help in the deterrence. Two, we provide the commitment of the United States of America to our allies. And three, in the context of complementary capabilities, the U.S. complements very well the Republic of Korea Armed Forces in the event of crisis. The other thing that I think as you think about anti-Americanism, you've got to put it in the context of time. You've seen, I will not say a sea change since the election, but you've seen a change since the election. So in that context, I think for the most part, the Korean people are very people to people, very friendly with the Americans who serve there, and very appreciative for that matter.
I'm sorry, we're only going to have time for one more question, and that goes to you, sir.
Hi, my name is Young-Soo Kim, second-year MPP student from the Kennedy School. Having heard the opinions of the panel today, I feel much more safe as a South Korean national. But I guess that the problem is it's not Democrats, but Republicans who make decisions from the current U.S. government at the moment. So I think the lack of information about North Korea is a big problem always. U.S. or even to South Korean government. My question goes to Professor Carter. To what degree the current government listened to those policy practitioners during the Clinton government?
Well, the problem is it's oversimplifies it, I think, to say Democrats versus Republicans, because the Republicans are divided in themselves. By the way, the Democrats are too. This is a difficult issue, and I think as we've, I think, illustrated here, it's a lot of lousy options to pick amongst. It's not surprising that it becomes a political football. It's not surprising that it's a difficult issue. So I think this administration is divided within itself. I believe there are members of the current administration who have the identical view to the ones that we formulated at the end of the Clinton administration. And there are others who either have a different view or are formulating their view. And I think the president's in that latter category, and you simply have to hope that in time he will come to a judgment among all of these big potential strategies we've talked about: isolation and collapse, reform, attack, let them go nuclear, or talk to them and see what you can get. But I don't think anybody up here or anybody in any party is prepared to say now, and I don't believe any of my colleagues here are prepared to say, I know what will work with the North Koreans. It's the only thing you're going to say is, here, this might be worth a try, let's give it a go and see. I'm not sure that North Korea isn't determined to get nuclear weapons. And maybe we can slow them down, but I don't think we can erase the desire in a regime that sees nuclear weapons as part of being a big grown-up country, which they want to be, and sees it as the only way ultimately to protect a besieged country from a world that has essentially passed them by historically. So I think we need and I think my advice would go, if I may give some gratuitous advice, to the South Korean government as well, which is in its own way groping towards a solution that is politically sustainable there. This is a hard one. It's going to take some time and we're going to have to be willing to allow our leaders to try out a few things. And give them the latitude, rather than stand over and say, well, boy, there you are dealing with those bums, the North Koreans, and aren't we know they're cheaters. We got to try something out here, and I think the Bush administration is slowly coming to a point of view that they're willing to advance to North Korea. Let's just hope it's successful. And on that note, hoping it's successful, let me close this evening and thank very much our three very distinguished and terrific presidents. Well done, guys. Well done, as always.
We're out of here. Coming over?
Yeah, sure. You get geared up. Get my appetite back. Good. Getting mushroom burger, man. Nah,
Oh,
can't
yeah.
have that mushroom burger. Oh, yeah. Going all out. Like, get that down. Yeah, yeah. All right, Jeff, good seeing him.